No, I forget the name. The name is it's complicated, but I could maybe get it. Like, I
Okay.
could maybe ask my dad, and then he would tell me, and then I can tell you. But, so yeah, so I'm from Muscadet First Nation Reserve, and then my dad was born there and raised there. My grandpa, same thing, and then my great grandpa was the chief on Muscadet for the longest time, and so my great grandpa, Chief Andrew Bear, he attended residential schools, and then my grandpa also attended partial of the residential schools. So because he was in between kind of that era where it was, they were still, the residential schools were still going on, but they were in the process of being shut down.
Yeah.
So that's like my grandpa, and then.
So if your grandpa was kind of in that era where he started in residential school,
Mm-hmm.
was he like taken back to his family, and was there like complications? Like, did your family speak English and like things like that?
So my grandpa, like still to this day, he speaks like pretty fluent Cree, and then like it was more of it wasn't, my great grandpa would have went through the whole process of being taken away from his family, not sure if he was coming back kind of deal. And then my grandpa was more at the process where they knew that their kids were going to residential schools, so they let them be transported there kind of thing, and then they knew where home was, so he came home kind of thing.
Okay.
So, and then, yeah, I was just going to say that I've noticed through the generations that, like, my dad is still kind of learning how to be a dad, and then, like, that affects, obviously, me, right, because I'm trying to still understand, like, what a father, like, the role of that and what he does and how he supports me, and he's doing, like, a good job. Don't get me wrong, I love my dad, but he struggles with it because my grandpa was, like, a hard alcoholic, and he was very, like, they farmed, so he farmed, and then he would get, like, drunk, and then it wasn't very good. So my grandma had kids, obviously, with my grandpa, and then those kids didn't really have a father because my grandpa would be out and getting drunk or be away from the family kind of thing. And then I also think, like, it's, talking about the intergenerational trauma, it's more of my great grandpa went to the residential school, was greatly affected. It then affected my grandpa because he didn't have a father. And so then grandpa chose to use substance for coping, and the kind of trauma or struggles that he went through growing up, and then it affected my dad, and then now it's affecting me.
So did your great grandpa go back and learn like the way of his like First Nations culture and things like that, or was it your grandpa? That, like, where did your grandpa learn to speak Cree?
Like Cree. So it would have been home. Yeah. Like, it would have been growing up in the reserve, and then from his dad and his mom, because they were very, like, fluent Cree and culturally invested. Yeah. So, because they went to the powwows, and he would talk about the smudges and all that kind of stuff.
So my first question here that I have written down is, I guess we kind of already talked about it. It said, what type of intergenerational trauma have you and your family suffered?
Yeah, so I would say just growing up, well, not only because I was brought into the world when my grandpa basically finished his alcohol phase. Like, he began sobriety, all that stuff, when my sister came into the family, and so then he was just smoking. And so, like, I'm sure, like, smoking, I feel like it's just a very common, like, Indigenous thing. Like, I feel like all, like, males predominantly, and even females, like, they smoke. So I'm like, my grandpa smoked until I was probably 8, and then he quit. And so then kind of going off topic, but so never really saw that side of my grandpa, but I've just heard stories about it, like, from my dad, that he was very abusive and he was a drunk. So then that obviously affected my dad. And then since my dad didn't have really a dad, he still is learning the kinks of how to be a dad. And, like, sometimes I have to kind of tell him, like, like text me, tell me you want to go out for supper, like
Yeah.
stuff like that, like make the effort.
How has your family dealt with this trauma? Have you had any like traditional healing approaches or taken any traditional healing approaches?
Oh, and then I was going to say how where you were affected too as a family is that my auntie was abused by my grandpa. So then that's affected her to this day. So I was like, we've gone through that as a family about how there's that history, that past history. Traditional kind of ways, like I feel like just as a family, we kind of just went through that phase where all the grandkids would spend time with grandma and grandpa, and we would learn, like he would either just have time, like he would just tell us stories about it, or he would help teach us Cree. Like we went to the school in Muscadet, and so we learned how to speak or certain sentences or phrasings or starts, basics of the Cree language. And so we would go home and grandpa would kind of help and just try and get us to talk more and to further that understanding in our culture for the language of it. And then he always took us to the powwows, the annual powwows that we had on Muscadet. So like we did that, but I wouldn't say there was any healing from that trauma that we went through as a family, no.
What struggles have you felt like you as a person and your family have had to overcome because of residential schools?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I feel like we had to, well, even I'm a very proud, like, and so there's so many terminologies nowadays too, because first it was you're an Indian, right? Like I'm a status Indian. And then it was, no, that's offensive, you can't say Indian. So then it was First Nations. And then First Nations apparently is offensive, so now it's Aboriginal. So I mean, there's so many things. So I feel like even just us going through that, it's like we're Indians. Like, and I mean, the only way that we will get offended over that term is when somebody uses it negatively or like, derogatory, like meaning kind of thing. But I feel like we have struggled, and I have even struggled with just the loss of culture that we've experienced. Just, like I didn't grow up with with a better understanding of my culture and where I come from and my language. And I was very fortunate to go to a reserve school, and so that's when it would help. But I also feel like, even elders, they don't know, like they have kind of lost the native tongue that we should have. But I feel like it all stems from the residential schools of where it was taken out of them, right? They weren't allowed to speak their language, weren't allowed to express their cultures. Even just learning something as simple as beading, like beading moccasins or doing that stuff. Luckily, my stepmom knows how to do mitts and how to do earrings and stuff like that, so I'm very fortunate that way, in McBannock, because that's a huge thing. But I don't know, I feel like just we've struggled with the loss of culture from residential schools, and then we've also went through that intergenerational trauma about how it's affected my grandpa because he went, and then it affected my grandpa, and then it all stems from that, but it still has traumatic effect on like the generations past.
So how do you feel about having to be a spokesperson for Aboriginal culture?
I don't know. I feel good. I mean, I am proud to be a Aboriginal woman. And I'm saying that because I don't even know what term to even use anymore. But
Yeah.
I'm very proud of who I am and my culture and what I grew up learning about my culture and stuff like that. And I mean, I also come from a high school in PA, and I am somewhat classified as like an successful, like not only academically but sports. And so because I am Aboriginal and I have exceeded, schooling and education and stuff like that, that I am used as kind of like a role model for other kids like who come from my background so that they can look up to me as a role model and say like, okay, like she can do it, so I can. And so I mean, it's very, I feel like it's important, and I mean, I don't mind it, but then again, it's also like, I feel like it sometimes is overused. Like, I don't know, I just feel like just because of the way I grew up or the culture that I have, like I have all the answers, or that I, you know, understand everything, or the whole genocide or all that kind of stuff, that I know all the secrets, and I don't. So
Is the impact of residential schools, or just residential schools in general, commonly discussed in your family, or is it?
no, I would say I only, like, I knew about it, but nothing was really discussed further on it until I was older. Like, it was more of when I was younger, you know, it was like, you know, Grandpa Andrew, what Dad would say, and he'd be like, he went to a residential school, and I was like, okay. And then I never really knew anything further more than that, right, growing up. And then it was like, oh, Grandpa Barrow also went to a residential school partially, and I was like, okay. And then as I was getting older, I was getting more brave and being like, okay, so like, tell me like more about this, like what is this, like how does this? And so then he would say, and then of course there was stories that I was told, and you know, they're not very nice, like they're pretty graphic, or they're, you know, pretty demeaning of just like our culture and stuff. And you know, you learn that kind of side, and it's a very negative and harsh and traumatic side. And so, you know, part of my character too is that I'm willing to listen and to learn about it, but there's only so much that I want to be able to ask, and not have them feel like they have to relive that experience over and over again, or feel that like, you know, I'm demanding that kind of information out of them. So yeah, I feel like I didn't quite answer that.
I feel like that was good.
Okay.
I don't really have any more questions. Is there anything else you want to add?
Don't think so. Like, is there anything that you're just curious about or want me to touch more base on?
So one of the teacher that I do my field placement with, he's very passionate. He's like European, like he's white. He doesn't all his students, I think, except for like probably 3 or 4 First Nations at this school. Yeah. And he's very passionate about like truth and reconciliation. Mm-hmm. So how do you feel, what's your perspective when people say we're all treaty people? Like, do you think like, no, this is my family suffers, like this is something we've dealt with, I don't want you to claim our race or claim our spirituality or
right. Well, and I feel like the whole truth and reconciliation it's a very powerful statement, and I think it's getting more attention than it ever did. And so it's great, and there's so much ambition of other people and like wanting to be a part of it, and I don't think that's wrong. But then I also think that there comes a point in almost like a boundary where people who want to help and to understand, they need to have that whole understanding that there comes a point of only so much that you can do and only so much that you understand before it's like, what's the word I'm trying to look for? Like, I keep trying to repeat myself. There's that understanding to reconciliation, but I feel like the only way that there can be true reconciliation is for those people that were affected directly. Yeah. Can go through that whole process of the healing and forgiving. And not saying that everybody has to forgive, but I just feel like that's the whole part of the healing process, is being able to forgive and not forget. I mean, that's